Hi everyone, today I'm doing a review of my Jaguar XJ Super V8. It's an X350 era car, and it's actually the second one of these that I've owned. They're a fantastic combination of supercharged V8 power and excellent levels of refinement and luxury. I've actually also owned several other so-called super saloons from the same era, BMW 7 Series, a couple of Mercedes S-Classes and Audi S8. And it got me wondering whether actually I prefer this British offering over those of its German rivals from the same era. So today I'm going to do a full review of my XJ Super V8, talk a bit about the history, the looks, the styling, the interior, the spec, and of course the driving, and then give you my thoughts about how I think it compares with those German rivals. The first Jaguar XJ came out in 1968 as the Series 1, and there were a couple of revisions to that platform, culminating in the Series 3 in 1979. Famously designed by Pininfarina, it was classic, elegant Jaguar good looks. The Series 3 continued to 1986 when it was replaced by the XJ40 platform, although actually the Series 3 continued in V12 form until I think 1992. But the XJ40 platform had quite a different design and look with its squarish headlights, an overall aesthetic that personally I'm not so keen on. The platform saw revisions in the form of the X300 in 1994, and that X300 actually saw a return to the more curvy looks of perhaps the Series 3. And then a further revision to the platform in the form of the X308 came in 1997. And that X308 generation I think is really classical, elegant, good looks, while still looking modern, and I really like the X308 design. The X300 saw the introduction of the first XJR, at that time a supercharged 6-cylinder engine. And the X308 platform also saw the introduction of the V8s, replacing the 6-cylinder engines, at that time a 3.2 and a 4-litre engine. And it also saw the introduction of the 4-litre supercharged AJ-V8 engine in the XJR. And then in 2003, the X350 came along, a totally new and revolutionary platform, and this is a very early example of that 2003 model. And whilst it retained a broadly similar styling to the X308, it was a much bigger car. In my opinion, it looks much more cumbersome. It was 50mm wider, 100mm longer, and crucially for me, 145mm higher. That, in my opinion, is really what lets the car down a bit in its styling. I think it looks good overall, but just too cumbersome with that extra height in particular. But that broadly similar styling actually belied the fact that this was a revolutionary design. It used a bonded and riveted aluminium chassis and aluminium body panels. And of course that gave a huge weight saving despite the extra size, apparently over 170 kilogram weight saving in XJR form. So the X350 also saw the development of the V8 engines from 3.2 to 3.5 and from 4 litres to 4.2 litres in the AJ-V8 format, and that was a much more reliable engine. And it was the supercharged 4.2 variant that was put in the XJR. And the X350 platform also saw the first introduction in Jaguar form of the XJ Super V8. And the Super V8 is really an XJR with all the bells and whistles, but in comfort spec. So whilst the XJR was designed to be a sporty model, the Super V8 was designed to be ultra luxurious, high refinement, high comfort, so much more comfort orientated. So in addition to those major revisions that the X350 platform saw, there was a lot of other ones. It was much more modern in many aspects, and I'll talk through a lot more of those whilst driving. So first impressions, it feels a lovely place to be, very comfortable. It feels luxurious with this beautiful Burr Walnut dash, leather everywhere, this wood and leather trimmed steering wheel. It feels special, and that's crucial for this kind of car. I actually am a convert to the lighter leather interior, which I'm not usually a huge fan of, but this barley colour, I believe it's called leather interior, looks wonderful in here. You're also reminded that you're in a supercharged car, in case you should forget, with supercharged logo on both the temperature and gauge and tacho. So yeah, great first impressions. The other first thing I notice is just how big this bonnet looks out in front of me. It really is vast, not only long out in front of me, but also very high up, and you certainly feel like you're in a very large car. So starting her up, you can hear you're in a V8, but fairly quiet and refined as you'd expect from this kind of car. The gearbox also super smooth. again, as you'd expect. And I'll talk a bit more about the performance of the engine and the gearbox once things are warmed up. You can probably see from the videos that the condition of this car is excellent inside and out. It's really immaculate, and it spent most of its life being a chauffeur car in Tokyo. Looking back at the original prices of these, they started at around just under £70,000 in the UK without any options. In today's money, that is equivalent to £125,000, so a really expensive car at the time. With the few options that this car had on, it was around about the £75,000 mark, which is over £130,000 in today's money. Interestingly, it has the standard Prestige wheels. Lots of people upgraded to 20-inch Sepang. The Prestige wheels I think look good on this car, but they're certainly not a type of wheel I would choose for many other cars, but I think they suit the character of this car. But going back to the price, I think these are now incredible value when you consider what you get for the money. I bought this one at an auction and it was well south of £10,000. I think that represents excellent value. And just a quick comment on the production numbers of this car. It's quite difficult to find accurate figures online, but the numbers I've seen suggest there are a total of over 126,000 XJs as a whole in the X350 era. And of those, only 250 to 300 of those were XJ Super V8s worldwide, with the majority of those going to the US and then to the UK. So actually really quite a rare car, in fact. Not only does it feel really comfortable and luxurious in here, but the spec of the car for its age is really quite incredible, I think. Given it's nearly getting on for 22 years old now. So it has automatic xenon headlights, automatic wipers, it's got a multi-function steering wheel where you can control the volume of the radio, etc., as well as the adaptive cruise control. That radar cruise control is a really excellent system, probably the best I've owned actually, and much better than the Audi that I owned, which is half this car's age. It obviously has a touchscreen, which was quite rare on a car of this age. It still works well. Air conditioning, climate control, radio, 6 CD changer in the boot, a mini disc player, which is of course a sign of the times, fully electric, heated, memory leather seats. It's got front and rear parking sensors, forward alert as well. And then in the rear, it also has electrically adjustable heated rear seats, which I think is incredible spec as well. It has TV screens in the back of the headrests for the rear passengers, where you can also control the DVD player, which is in the boot, through a central console in the central armrest, which allows you to control also the radio and other things. So all of that combined, just incredible spec. Heated electric mirrors, of course, I forgot to mention. And one of my favourite features on cars like this is the electric rear blind, which you can put up at the touch of a button. This doesn't have a heated steering wheel, but it was an option on this. What it does have is electrically adjustable steering wheel, but also pedals. What doesn't it have? It doesn't have a sunroof. I think that was an option. I don't see many with them. That would be nice to have. No double glazing. Not a huge issue from my perspective, but it's not the quietest car at motorway speeds like we're doing now. It's not overly noisy, but certainly could be quieter. No soft closed doors on this car either. Unlike some of its competitors, it does have a soft closed boot, but not doors. So overall, fantastic spec for the age. Everything works really nicely. It's well laid out. So this car is super comfortable with the air suspension. It's very much comfort focused car. It absorbs the bumps superbly well and makes doing a lot of miles a very pleasant experience actually. The flip side of that is it does roll a bit. There's some body roll round corners, you can probably see around there, but actually for the size of the car it's not that bad. You can still have quite a lot of fun chucking it round corners, and it does that surprisingly well, helped by the fact probably that it's a relatively light car for its size. I'd personally like a little bit more body control. I believe they did briefly do a sport suspension option on this shorter wheelbase car, which was dropped when the long wheelbase came in as standard. I'm not sure many people would have spec'd a sport suspension on a car like this. There was always the XJR if you wanted the sportier setup. But this air suspension was adaptive. It used Jaguar's famous CAT system, and I believe actually lowers the car at motorway speeds as well. So yeah, the cornering and handling is actually really good in this. Quite impressive for the type of car. Perhaps let down by one of the weak points of the car, in my opinion, which is the steering. It's overly light and overly assisted. There's pretty much zero feel and no feedback from the road through it. So we're just going into a de-restricted zone, so listen to that supercharger. Supercharger whine, hopefully you can hear a little bit. So that brings me on to the performance. This car has tons of performance. It's a great engine. It stood the test of time really well. Still delivers what is, even by modern standards, a decent amount of power and torque. Roughly 400 horsepower, just under, and roughly 400 pound-foot of torque. And because it's supercharged, you've got torque from very low down. It's super responsive. The throttle response is pretty good, especially for the type of car. And helped by the fact that this is only 1650, 1675, depends who you believe, kilograms. You know, it gives decent performance. 5.1 seconds to 60 is good for a car like this, even in today's money. It feels like it's got plenty of power all the time, wherever you are in the rev range. And you can surprise quite a few cars in this. You know, you compare this with modern cars of the same type and size, I expect they're going to be pretty much 400 kilograms or so heavier than this. So you can see why, with that weight advantage, it actually performs very well, both in a straight line and round the corners, compared with some other cars in its class.
The traction control system is very invasive. You can obviously turn it off, but then it's very easy to spin the back wheels with the amount of torque that's available. I actually really feel it would benefit from a limited slip diff, but I can understand why it wasn't fitted on this kind of car.
So the gearbox the engine is mated to is good. It's a ZF 6-speed. That's an upgrade over the 5-speed, which was in the X308 generation. And the gearbox is good. It particularly for the age, it shifts very smoothly. They're not the fastest changes by today's standards compared with, say, a ZF 8-speed. But compared with other offerings from the time, I'm thinking particularly Mercedes S-Class with their 5-speed auto, even their 7 G-Tronic, this is good. The kickdown is average in normal comfort mode. You put it in sport mode and it's a bit better, it hangs onto the revs longer. In comfort mode, it will change up even if you're flooring it at about 4,000 RPM. So you really don't get to use the full extent of this engine and rev it out at all if you're in comfort mode, which is a bit of a criticism. Now I realise that this car isn't meant to be revved hard all the time like that, and also the fact that it's got oodles of supercharged torque means you don't need to anyway, so it's no particular problem. But sometimes it's nice to be able to rev that engine out, and you can do that in the sport mode. Then I guess the limiting factor is the really quite long gearing of this gearbox. I noticed the other day the car in second gear, and it got to the red line at about 6,000 RPM, and it was doing almost bang on 17 miles an hour. So that long gearing also means that you don't get to use the full rev range of the engine very often. The long gearing does, I suppose, help the MPG, as does the relatively light weight. I've been pretty impressed with this car. It'll give high 20s on long journeys easily. On days when there's more traffic and you perhaps can't go at maximum speed, this will do low 30s easily. I think that's pretty impressive for the size of the car and the performance it gives. Coming back to the gearbox, it's got the famous Jaguar J-gate, so you can, of course, shift and drive over to this side of the gearbox where you can restrict the maximum gear that the gearbox will let you have. So currently in 5th, restricts it to 4th, restricts it to maximum 3rd. I usually like shifting automatic gearboxes manually sometimes myself, particularly for the control it gives you and a greater level of engagement. I don't find that this system is particularly good, and I don't really use it. I suspect very, very few people shift manually using this J-gate in this type of car. I think for me, it's fundamentally doesn't feel quite precise enough when you're shifting between the gears, and it perhaps doesn't give you that level of confidence that you're going to not shift on to the next gear down, for example. And either way, I don't think it works particularly well, but it's nice to have, I suppose. It's quite difficult to get the engine and supercharger noise come out on the video, but we'll just do a getaway here in sport mode and see how it sounds. Yeah, so it's a very pleasant whine. The engine obviously isn't particularly loud. I think it actually sounds quite a bit better from outside. The exhaust noise is, as I say, is better than you might think. And for all as I mentioned, there's very little steering feel and feedback, and a little bit too much body roll for my liking. It's really not that bad. You can see going around these roundabouts, we're not lurching all over the place. And perhaps because it's so light, I still have the confidence to chuck this round corners, even though the steering feel is somewhat limited. It does do what you tell. The front end goes where you want it to. It doesn't push wide, particularly, for example. So that is confidence inspiring. And you can see coming up to another roundabout here, you get an idea of how much body roll there is. As I say, it's not terrible. Then we can power out of there. Yeah, very nice to drive. It's surprisingly good to drive for the type of car, the class of car that it is. So problems and reliability, there weren't actually a huge number of major problems with these cars. This 4.2 litre development of the XJ V8 engine is actually really reliable. It's proved to be very strong, as has the gearbox. The only significant problem, I suppose, is with the lower so-called valley coolant hoses, which are in a very hot place and could degrade over time. Those need replacing, and because they're a pig to get to, that's quite an expensive job. The air suspension does have issues, like many cars of this era. I don't think they're particularly bad. The fans can go in the heating, and that's an expensive job because it's a dash-out job. So these don't suffer from rust in the same way, of course, being an aluminium construction, but you do get some aluminium corrosion on them. This is a Japanese import, actually, so is really corrosion-free, often much better examples from Japan. Added to the fact that I think their roads are often better condition, no salt on the roads. They're often very well treated and cared for cars as well. The added benefit of having a Japanese import is perhaps the leaping Jaguar on the front bonnet that this car retains, whilst UK models had done away with that by this time. Other issues I didn't mention: the adaptive cruise control, the radar cruise control can have issues which can be quite difficult to diagnose. Quite annoying problem, I suppose, is the headlining of these cars, which is notorious for sagging. Almost all XJs of this era will have at some point had some level of sagging headlining, and that can also be quite an expensive job to replace. I believe it's down to the glue that they use that just degrades over time, and I think the problem is much worse in hotter climates where the glue degrades much more quickly. This car has clearly had the headlining replaced at some point. I think it's in perfect condition. So overall, what do I think about this car? I mean, it's a fantastic car. Like I've said, superb levels of luxury, refinement, and that really special feel, which I think is important in these kind of cars. Tons of power and performance, and actually, you know, fairly hard to fault. Perhaps one thing I didn't mention on the downside: the interior space, despite the size of the car, is not great. So the front cabin doesn't feel cramped, but it's not that spacious. Comparing it with 7 Series and S-Class that I've owned, nowhere near as big. But actually the real downside of this car is the rear legroom, which is really not great. So this is short wheelbase, but even in the longer wheelbase that they did, the rear legroom was not that great, particularly for a car which is meant to be chauffeuring people around. And it can't compare to the 7 Series and S-Class in that respect, for sure. The boot space, however, is very good.
The boot's about 470 litres, so it was a bit smaller than those of its rivals, which were generally just over the 500 litre mark.
And so that brings me on to comparisons with the other so-called super saloons, executive saloons that I've owned from the same era. And maybe I'll just give you my thoughts on a rundown of the ones I've owned. So I owned an Audi D2 S8. So that generation of S8 actually finished in 2003 when this car was built. The next generation, the D3 S8, didn't come out until 2006. So I can only really compare it to that D2 that I've owned. But that S8 was fundamentally a 1990s car, and so in many ways it's just not comparable with this, particularly the interior specification and the technology. Extremely dated, didn't feel special inside particularly. Nothing particularly wrong with it, but just much more old-fashioned. Technology had moved very quickly at that time. It still had a cassette player, for example. So easy win there for the Jag. The S8 had a 4.2 litre naturally aspirated V8. It only gave 335 horsepower, I believe. But in fact, it didn't feel underpowered. The Quattro all-wheel drive, of course, helped with lower speed acceleration and helped it get to 0 to 60 in 5.6 seconds. So it was decent performance. So in the handling department, it might actually surprise you to learn that I think the S8 actually handled better than this XJ. Yeah, it handled really nicely. It was a much lower car, which helped lower centre of gravity. But it felt nice through the corners, helped of course by the Quattro all-wheel drive. It didn't appear to understeer like many Audis I've owned, or quite not to the same extent. I do wonder if mine was on some aftermarket springs. I'm not actually entirely sure. Either way, it was a good handling car, but the long and short of it is that it just couldn't compare with the interior specification, the technology and the power of this XJ, so no contest. I also owned E65 7 Series BMW, so that was I think a 2005 or 6 model, I can't quite remember. There was also a 760 at the time, which had a naturally aspirated V12. You could argue is potentially a better comparison with this XJ Super. I haven't owned one though, so I'm comparing it to the 750i that I owned. That was a 4.8 litre naturally aspirated V8, 360 horsepower, roughly 360 pound-foot. It didn't feel like it had that much power. It felt sluggish and really quite slow, almost underpowered. Perhaps the fact that it was also a huge feeling barge, and I think substantially heavier than this. I don't know the figures off the top of my head, but I would imagine it's a good 250 kilograms heavier than this. Looks were not great, quite divisive at the time. It hasn't aged well. Didn't feel special inside the interior. The spec wasn't amazing. And to top it all off, the iDrive system that BMW had at that time was absolutely atrocious. Without doubt, the worst system I've used. So I really sound like I'm sledging BMW and 7 Series. I'm not. It's just I didn't enjoy many aspects of that car particularly. So yeah, hands down, the XJ is much better than that car. Then I've owned 2 Mercedes S-Classes, a W221 era S-Class, which was a 2010 model in my case. That's not really a fair comparison. I think that model came out in 2005, possibly 2006. So really a later generation. I had a S500, 5.5 litre naturally aspirated V8, 360 horsepower. Lovely car, the interior spec was lovely, didn't feel quite as special, technology was better, fairly sluggish feeling engine, not helped by the equally sluggish 7G-tronic gearbox. But I'm actually going to compare this to the previous generation, so the W220 era car. My W220 was an S600, also 2003, so perhaps a better comparison. Although one might argue this could also be compared with the S500 of the age. I haven't owned one of those, so I'm comparing it to the S600, and that had the M275 engine, an absolutely epic engine, 5.5 litre twin turbo V12. Gave 500 horsepower and 800 newton meters of torque, and you know, quite a special engine. It was a bored out 6 litre version that was put in the S65 AMG, and also a derivative of the engine that ended up in the Pagani Hyura. So that shows you the kind of engine we're talking about here. So refined, so smooth, being V12, and just masses of power and torque. So it wins hand down there for the S600. Mated to, though, a pretty rubbish 5-speed auto box, which was probably a weak point of the car, to be honest. The interior of that S600, it didn't feel as special as this XJ. It didn't feel as luxurious. The tech was good. It had just as much, if not more tech, in fact. Soft closed doors, double glazing, cooled seats. But that tech was prone to going wrong. I don't think my dynamic seats, for example, worked. And the 220 was kind of famous for this, introducing a lot of very new tech, particularly electronics, that perhaps wasn't fully tested or developed as as it is in later years, and ended up failing. So overall looks of the car, I think the XJ wins as well. So for all that engine was outstanding, I think the Jaguar XJ edges it there as well. And perhaps one car I should give an honourable mention to that I haven't mentioned, and that's primarily because I haven't owned one, is a Lexus LS. You know, they're the top of the range, super luxury, have a great reputation. It would have been the LS 430 at the time, 4.3 litre V8 engine, only 290 horsepower, and for me that's not even a comparison. It would be way too underpowered for what I want. I know not everyone wants extremely high power cars, but for what I want from that type of car, that's just not enough power. I think it was 0 to 60 in 6.9 seconds. Again, just not fast enough, and so for me there would be no contest with the Jag in that case. So there you go. Having talked through it, I think I've managed to declare this Jaguar XJ Super V8 the best executive super saloon that I've owned. Really interested to hear your thoughts if you've owned one of these or similar cars, and about my comparisons. It's obviously highly subjective, but I love this car. It's a great balance of all those things: luxury, refinement, power. And it retains that class, I think. I suppose very subjective, because a lot of people will say this is very much an old man car, old man spec with the wood and leather, etc. I guess fairly British in a lot of ways, but I'm British, I like it. So there we go, my thoughts. Please let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'll be doing more videos on this and my other cars, so do check out some of my other videos in case some of my other cars interest you. And yeah, thanks very much for watching,